Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Modern Meathead Experience. Today, I wanted to talk a little bit about science-based lifting and more specifically, the problems associated with what has sort of become uh, uh, something that I think is culturally relevant. So I think it's important to talk about, but also problematic just from a lot of different standpoints. Training and practical application, as well as just actually like learning things. Like learning things, I feel like now more than ever is really easy in some ways, right? Because you have all this information, but then simultaneously you get all different kinds of people doing all different kinds of things with that information. And so I'm not exactly sure when the whole sort of science-based, movement started. Ethan, you can maybe comment on that in a little bit. I'm assuming you're probably more familiar with that than I am, just because it's probably one of those things that's like it's always been a thing, but now it's like sort of blowing up as a term, like, hey, I'm a science-based lifter, or this is a science-based program. And I wanted to just kind of start by talking about what I think the sort of like associated problems with this movement is. And I think the first problem to be recognized is just really like the use of the term science in this context. It's kind of like science in many contexts, not just like fitness and lifting related stuff, has been, I don't know if weaponized is exactly the word. Maybe that's a little bit extreme, but it's like kind of turned into like a marketing term, right? And especially in this particular context, you stumble upon someone's Instagram bio or their YouTube channel or YouTube video. And the word science is like, it's something that is now tacked on a thumbnail or like put in a title, or put in a bio link, science-based programs here. And I think that the reason that's problematic is not just because, changing the definitions of terms is problematic, which it obviously is, but really because like I think it moves people away from actually understanding like what science is and why it's so useful. And then from a practical standpoint, like why having a scientific mindset, if I'll call it that, is actually really, really helpful just on a purely practical level. And I think that we can sort of get into that today, but that's kind of where I'll start, which is just this idea that science has been sort of conflated with fact. I think primarily, like whenever someone hears this is a science-based workout, what they're hearing isn't like any nuance around, oh, like what do these studies say? What do the participants in the study look like? And what is their experience? Like no one is like going into the PubMed, database and like reading articles that people are citing. Um, what people are doing is they're interpreting science as in this context of the fitness industry and science-based lifting as um, you know, content creators who use the word science. They're basically just like handing us a silver platter of like facts about the world. And like if I can just do the exercises that are factually more efficient, that are factually more effective for XYZ muscle, then I'll just like achieve results faster. I'll be bigger in the end. Not only will I do those things, but I can do other things like I can burn fat more quickly or lose weight more quickly. Right? It's all kind of under the same bubble. So there are a lot of different problems with this, and that I'm sure we'll get into today in a number of different areas, both like theoretical and practical. But just as an overall starting point, I just want to make it super clear that sort of where I'm coming at this conversation from is just identification of the problem, which to me is just a misunderstanding of like what a scientific mindset, what a scientific framework actually is, and then how people are distorting that reality for things like, clicks and views and likes and program sales. And so, Ethan, to funnel it down and make it like really specific in terms of a segue to you, um, how do you kind of conceptualize, like, how would you simply explain to someone like what a scientific mindset actually is? Because I think you, more than anyone that I know, are someone who really embodies this, not only on like a theory-based level, but also just in practice. Like, I think you're someone who people can readily identify as like a very scientific-minded person, at least in the correct use of the term. So for someone who's maybe never heard of like what science actually is, or like what a scientific framework might actually be, how would you go about describing what that is, just as kind of a starting point and a foundation for the conversation ahead?
Yeah. I mean, because my starting place is not that I'm trying to be scientific or, I'm trying to appeal to sciencey people. It's just kind of an expression of me. I could simply just kind of give my history and maybe like perspective on, how I think about some of these questions,
Yeah.
which is just that I have a broad destination that I'm trying to go to. Like I have a goal, as we often talk about, and I have curiosity. And I find it exciting and thrilling to just try to get to the bottom of the questions that'll move me towards that goal, but without really a bias towards needing to be right or needing to prove to other people that I have the right answer. Um, when you were talking before about like where did the science-based movement start, I imagine a lot of this stuff just comes down to changes in technology more than changes in people. I don't think that we're evolving or de-evolving, at any particular pace that is like outpacing technology, and just like the access that we have to information. So I imagine bodybuilders 50 years ago, given the same tools we have now, would behave in just the same way. And the information that they had access to, they held, wholly as well. So if it was Arthur Jones speaking about something to, his contemporaries, or if it was, say the Weeder principles, uh, people who were interested in making progress turned to whatever tools they had. And that varies a little bit between individuals too. It's not just like, what do you have access to? The magazines, the internet, but it's also like, what do you personally have access to? Are you an intellectual person? Like, what kind of people did you grow up around? How were you taught to think? So some people, maybe it's a little more hands-on, and it's just kind of learning by doing. For other people, maybe it's more so about like trying to gather as much information as they can first to make an informed decision. So you have this combination of just like what's the individual's sort of personalities, personal gifts, and strengths and weaknesses, and then what's available out there in the world right now. And I think we're in an age where so much information is available that it really caters to people who maybe might not otherwise got into a very physical endeavor. So before, if it was just kind of like, all right, all we have access to is barbells and dumbbells, and to go to the place to learn these things, it was a pretty like rough environment, and you had to be physical and you had to be aggressive, and there was a degree of like a sense of risk or danger involved in it. There was a whole culture to it. You had to travel, and there was a lot of just like time and commitment of all involved in taking those first steps. So when you take that out of the equation, you have a different population now of people that are exposed to this sport or this endeavor. Uh, and speaking as someone who went to school for exercise science, who decided, I guess, at the age of 16 or so, that this is what I was going to do with my life. Um, I can speak as someone who had that opportunity, right? Whereas maybe like 10, 15 years before that, there weren't even schools for exercise sciences, particularly not for like lifting weights. There was a little bit, around cardiovascular training, and endurance sports. But really, I think when I was growing up, it was sort of the first boom of people going to school for exercise science and actually studying uh, what is now sort of like the science of bodybuilding. Like the Lane Nortons, for example, were not the earliest pioneers, but the earliest sort of public pioneers, in the sense that now we had like forums, bodybuilding.com, that sort of thing, where the information was becoming more widespread. But one of the things you see when you go to school for exercise science is there are actually people doing research and people teaching exercise science who don't actually work out or not like particularly interested in the training itself. There are multiple categories of people that, can be in this field, but not necessarily in it for the reasons you are. So one person might be in it just because they want to be really jacked. Another person might be in it because they want to explore the nuances of the sort of like physiological reactions that take place inside the body and what's literally happening on like a cellular level. So it's just a totally different motivation. And the idea that like one is right or one is wrong, I think we just have kind of more of a melding of the two now. Whereas before, it was just so clear cut. Like these are the bros who lift weights and these are the scientists, and they never really come together. And now you just have so much accessibility, not just of information, but also of gyms. And there's so many different cultures within lifting that everyone can kind of find their place, much like how bodybuilding now has the different classes. And at first it was like, oh, the men's physique guys don't, the bodybuilders don't want to talk to the men's physique guys. You kind of see over time, like everyone sort of gains a respect for one another, because we're all kind of on the same mission. But in terms of just thinking scientifically, I think it's just starting with a hypothesis. In this case, like if you have a goal, you have a hypothesis of, oh, I think this might be one way to get to that goal. And you just test it without bias, without thinking like, oh, I want it to be this way or I want it to be that way. Just being open to being wrong and actually being excited about being wrong because that means you have an opportunity for growth.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that is kind of the key point to me. And you started off with the word curiosity, which I think kind of like in terms of science, like if you could summarize it in one word, it's almost kind of like that's like the word of science, because curiosity implies that like, hey, there's this thing that I want to know that I currently don't know. And so therefore I'm going to run this experiment, whether in the lab or in the gym, and I'm going to figure out something. I don't exactly know exactly what it'll mean. I don't know what the results of this experiment might even indicate, because at that point, it's just like you just run another experiment and another experiment and another experiment. And I think that, as you said, it's kind of really interesting to me, the concept that two camps on the internet can be communicating with one another with all these different ideas about the other camp that might not even necessarily like be true. So if you were to tell someone who's maybe like kind of on social media and has heard this like science-based term thrown around, they might just automatically assume that anyone who uses the term or identifies with the term is like a soft pencil pusher, like who like can't bench a plate, right? And then on the flip side, someone who's maybe more keen on talking about like traditional strength training methods and free weights, and they're like they're sort of anti-machine, maybe just based on their bias or whatever it happens to be. The science-based lifter might sort of see that and then lump them into the category of all the other people that maybe share similar opinions. And so a lot of the time, at least on social media, people are kind of arguing past each other, in my experience. But where this really, I think this whole conversation started to actually matter to me, because initially I was kind of like, all right, people are just like arguing about words and like there's not actually any real implication. But I started to recognize that there were actually real consequences to this kind of misunderstanding of science when I started to meet people and see people training in particular ways and asking specific questions when they themselves were maybe not in a position where I felt like those questions or the way that they were training were appropriate, just based on sort of, where they are, right? A very simple sort of maybe uh, uh, just generalized example would be like if someone who maybe just starts lifting, or who maybe is like on the they're basically as far away from advanced as you could get while not being a beginner still, right? They're like, however you designate those stages, they're very not advanced, but they're also not a total beginner. They're somewhere in between. It's usually the kind of person that I feel like falls into the trap of asking questions like, how do I train like this specific position of this specific muscle with this specific profile, all the while like not knowing where the muscle is attached, right, in their body, or just something like that, right? It's like the whole picture to me is basically like there are these, baseline questions that make sense to me, i.e., where does this muscle attach? Where even is it in the body? And then there are questions that are actually built off of those questions, if that makes sense. And so I feel like a lot of what has happened with more information being out there is people are unknowingly skipping past the sort of initial layers of those questions, i.e., the big rocks, before they sort of get to the smaller rocks or the pebbles or the sand, that maybe fit into the bucket sort of after those big rocks. And so in short, I basically started to pay more attention to the kinds of language that people were using, just because I started to see it in people that I would meet and people who I already knew, who were maybe falling into like just practical traps that they, for whatever reason, couldn't work around. I.e., I'm not progressing on this exercise. Like, what can I do? That kind of question to me is in like a very different category than the other kind of questions that I am now receiving a lot of. And perhaps another good example of this might be the kind of question that we've talked about multiple times in the last couple of weeks, which is the question about like something like asymmetry, right? Like, my left foot turns out 5 degrees, more than my right. Like, what should I do about it? That kind of thing. That kind of question to me comes as a consequence of people presenting information about asymmetry online as like very scientific and well understood and with a high degree of certainty. And so people inevitably, I think, end up creating problems for themselves, looking for problems maybe that don't even necessarily need to be there to begin with. So ironically, I think that the whole science-based movement is one that people um, is really something that gives people a lot of certainty in what they're doing. Um, and that is antithetical to the whole point of science, which is that you admit to your uncertainty about the questions that you have. So it's this sort of weird paradox of information being presented very, very confidently and in a very sort of matter of fact way by people who are supposedly scientific and who, in some instances, are actually researchers and in some instances come from people who actually have PhDs. But they're not sending the actual message, to my point about it just being sort of like a marketing term. They're not actually sending a message of uncertainty because no one wants to like watch content and consume content and like have to then think about like, okay, what did this person just say? Do I believe it? What do I think? Even just asking like, hey, what do I think about this? That kind of question has almost just been removed entirely from people's minds. So where this actually conversation I think gets relevant for me is in the actual like weeds of application, when I think people start to maybe ask questions that are just not the right questions for them at that specific time, or maybe just questions that are never relevant to anyone really on any timeline, right? Like, oh, yeah, I could give a couple examples, but like the short, long muscle length conversation is a big sort of representation of all these different concepts into one over the last like year or so. Like the fundamental problem with what we're talking about right now has been expressed through something like that conversation, right? The idea that I should do this more lengthened exercise, and I should never do this other exercise over here because this lengthened exercise is better. And you end up hearing things and saying things like this past week. One of the self-identified science-based influencers that I have in mind made a video about how triceps pushdowns are one of the worst triceps exercises. And this is the same person who said that leg extensions are one of the worst quad exercises that you can do. Right. And so people who don't have too much of an understanding of this stuff actually will hear that information, trust that information, and then actually not do leg extensions or actually not do triceps pushdowns. Right. And then you end up with a situation now where you're not only unnecessarily limiting like your exercise options, but you're also potentially like removing a ton of enjoyment from training and things that may actually end up sort of allowing you to sort of push forward in whatever direction. So that was kind of a lot of different ideas, concepts there. Did anything come up for you at any point along the way there? Like, do you, as someone who's not really involved in the online zeitgeist, do you witness this kind of thing, or do you more so just hear it through me and things that I describe to you?
The place that I witness it unexpectedly is if I'm having a conversation with another lifter and they ask me a question in a framework that sort of makes me pause for a second and go, okay, there's a lot of missing pieces here. Like you're making jumps or you're talking about a really specific thing that's not tied to all these other things. So, someone, because I always mention that I'm in the sauna before this, like, I'm at
Yep.
the gym, someone's talking to me in the sauna, or, I go to another gym and I'm talking to another lifter or something, and they ask my opinion on a topic or they give their opinion on a topic. And lately, when I've realized that that question or that opinion isn't linked to a bunch of other thoughts that are sort of lateral to it, like they're just in a base, like a silo with that one thought, eventually it comes out that they heard that on social media, whether they like show you a post or they try to explain it and it just comes back to, oh, so and so said. So I've been able to identify it in real life when someone is speaking about a concept in a very siloed way, where it's like, oh, you understand this one theoretical concept that exists, but you don't understand how it's tied to all these other things. And if you don't understand its relevance or magnitude in relation to these other things, you can't really accurately assess where to put it or how much emphasis to place on it. So I think when you're just getting isolated concepts sort of out of the ether that are just dropped on you, you don't really know where they fit in the context of the rest of the story. So what happens is people talk to me about like a page in a book. I'm like, what the hell are you talking? Like, I know this is a thing, like I get it, but like what's your point? There's no story here. There's no context around it. You don't have any of the foundation to this, so it's kind of meaningless. Like, yes, it's a thing we can talk about in scientific terms, but no, I don't think it matters in the grand context of what you're trying to solve for because you don't understand the importance of the relevance of it, the magnitude of it, or how it ties to all these other things. So that's kind of where it shows up for me. I guess what comes to mind is like, where do we want to get to with this conversation? Like in this particular case, it's like, that's kind of annoying. And like, it depends on how much time I have to speak to this person. Like, if I have an hour to speak to the person, we can usually come around to the fact that to helping them understand like the bigger picture and maybe just get a better idea of how to consume the information. But if it's a 10-15 minute conversation, a lot of times, or less than that, a lot of times we can't really get the point across that you're just looking at the forest for the trees. So there's one of just like, how do we communicate? And in my case, with just like strangers, there's how do you communicate with your broader audience? And then there's maybe like, if I was in this person's shoes, how might I go about it? If I was recommending to someone who was in my shoes, 20 years ago, but in the modern day, like what advice might I give them? Is there one particular route that you want to take this from like a practical standpoint? Because I think for the most part in my life, it's just kind of like a little bit of an annoyance, but I don't really care. And I just think back to when I was in that position. It was like I was looking up new supplement ingredients and like the next muscle tech product comes out, or like I'm still reading out of the magazines. And I think we all do it, like I think anyone who's really excited about things and has that curiosity we mentioned before, I think they all kind of go through that phase if there's someone who's just like intellectually curious versus just physically needs to sort of work through some things. So I also appreciate the fact that like it comes and goes in phases. Even later in your learning career, it comes and goes in phases, but just less and less so. So I'm not too worried about people like if they just keep going, sort of coming back to home base. But maybe we want to help people that are just starting out, or maybe we want to talk about just how to communicate the information.
Yeah, so in my personal experience, where I see this show up the most, because I agree, like let's make it practical. Why does it actually matter? Because to me, on the one hand, it's just fucking annoying. Like I just get like the kinds of questions where I don't even know where to begin to start. Like there are like 20 different landmines that are dropped in a matter of 10 seconds that I have to, I'm worried I'm going to step on. Um, so on the one hand, it's annoying, and like to be honest, I can live with that. My my bigger concern is just like I'm I've had this conversation with myself a lot, right? Which is like, do I want to, as a content creator, like put information out in a way that encourages people to like think about the information a little bit more? Like, in other words, fostering a sense of that curiosity you were describing. Like, do I want to make content that fosters a sense of curiosity? Do I want to make content that is kind of neutral? So, like, I provide some nuance, but ultimately I give a very straightforward, practical recommendation for something. Or do I want to just like go full like science-based lunatic and basically like just create confident gross extrapolation after gross extrapolation and like just feed into the algorithms to see how much I can just maximize revenue. I tend to choose something in the middle where like I'm okay with a little bit of clickbait. I'm okay with a little bit of like you need to try this, one exercise type thing, but then I deliver the nuance and the practical application, right? And that even though I've distilled it down a lot, is very frustrating for a lot of people. Like I will get even if there's like a very clear, straightforward answer, I'll get comments all the time that are like, "This dude is saying nothing. Like he's just babbling on," right? Because that's kind of and we might say to that like, okay, that person's maybe just not the kind of viewer that I want, and I think that that would be fair. But by the same sort of or maybe just on a separate note rather, like I don't like I want to contribute, I guess, um to encouraging people to think more rather than less. But that's in some ways is dual-sided, right? Because you might actually start to get someone to overthink something and maybe dig themselves into a hole that they didn't need to begin with, that they didn't need to be dug into to begin with, and all sorts of other things. So that's just like for you to know personally, and then for just for context for the listener as well. I think in terms of like practical implications or practical application of this kind of information and maybe like framework, I think it would be helpful to speak to the person who's maybe like on the newer end of this spectrum. In other words, like the person who's maybe starting to learn a little bit about this stuff and maybe they follow a bunch of different content creators because they're not quite sure sort of like what is sticking for them and who they like more and who they're kind of on the fence about like, do I watch this creator more or this creator? I don't How do I feel about this communication? So maybe just like providing tools for the listener to help them better navigate the information space. I feel like that's kind of where I want to go with it. Like, what sort of pieces of advice can we give someone who is trying to go through this process on their own and who maybe doesn't have like someone like you or I to like just bounce ideas back off of one another to talk about concepts. Like what can we say to that person who is consuming a bunch of information from a bunch of different people? What are the sort of like, I guess, things to look for in how information is being communicated, and what sort of processes can someone start to maybe hone in or work on or introduce that can like better help their own ability to actually think about these concepts, right? Because we're talking in some sense about like a sort of meta level of thinking, like how do you think about thinking? But does that kind of make sense in terms of like a just a direction we can take things here? I know we don't have too much time, but just as kind of maybe some big picture points and takeaways as to why this sort of matters altogether. Does that direction kind of make sense to you?
Yeah. So maybe the only option isn't just how do you consume information on social media in a way that's going to take you from a novice stage to a more mature view, or a more sort of big picture, nuanced, and a sense of like wisdom. Like how do you get to that place of being advanced and having wisdom, and not being so easily influenced by false information, or new information that seems flashy at the time. And I don't think the only option is just like you have to be able to sort through the content and decipher what's good from bad. I think you can use some of the tools that people used in the past and just layer on some of these new tools, or some of the new information on top of that. And I think one of the big ways that people have gained expertise in the past is just simply by having a mentor, someone that understands you and the specific issues that you have, and just having a mission, and then having someone to sort of guide you on that mission. And the point is, it doesn't need to be the best person, it just needs to be the next best person. Like, it might start as just like your older brother, and maybe then it's just like the big guy at the gym, but in the meantime, you can kind of help filter their information by reading books or consuming content online, whether it be long form, short form. At the end of the day, like, I don't think there's any reason to shield yourself necessarily from that information, but I think you want to have someone that can help filter it for your own context, and make it specific to the journey that you're on. So I don't think it's a bad idea to just surround yourself with a community of people, or at least a person that can help you get started on that journey. And like I said, you're not going to know who's like the ideal person. It doesn't have to be someone that is like a PhD that you follow online and that you just like DM. It could just be someone at your local gym. But I think that's a reasonable place to start, is like, you want to actually be doing the thing, and you want to actually like have people around that can give context to your specific situation, because that's probably one of the most difficult parts, is you're consuming information and you don't really know how it applies to you today. Because if Ben's making content, like, he's not making content for you, he's making content for like the meme.
Mhm.
So it's tough to know where that specific person is at. It's tough for Ben to make content for people at every single stage in the game. But if you have a specific, if you have a mentor, or you have a group of people that are doing it together, I think it's a little bit more specific to like the place you're actually at. That's one thought, is just like, I don't think that you need to avoid consuming information this way. I think social media and things like podcasts are probably great ways to get specific types of information, but they're certainly not the only one.
Mhm. Yeah, so practically speaking, I'll address maybe the other side of that, which would just be like, if you are consuming information, what are maybe some things to keep in mind? And, this kind of to me goes back to what I was talking about in the beginning of this podcast, which is the concept of science, and what science is and what science isn't. And I think a big piece to the puzzle of science is to understand that science is descriptive and not prescriptive, right? So the sort of takeaway there being that what science does is it informs us within specific contexts as to what might be the best course of action moving forward, right? Or maybe we're just trying to understand a phenomena, and so we're getting some information about that phenomena, right? But it just simply describes what happened, right? So I ran this experiment with Ethan recently, where Ethan said, "Hey Ben, you should try um, um, Coke Zero, the Oreo flavor," which Ethan is just started drinking now. The mini can is recommended. And I was like, cool, I'm going to take Ethan's recommendation. And so I tasted the Diet Coke, uh, Oreo flavor. I made a conclusion about this flavor and I said it tastes really good, but it could use more carbonation. And that was simply just the description of that. Now, the prescription aspect of that, what I would not say in this case, and again, just to stick with the analogy, is everyone needs to try this Coke Zero flavor because I liked it, right? So science just gives us the description of, maybe how did this taste to this population, but it doesn't say like who should drink it, when they should drink it, why they should drink it. It doesn't sort of create a very clear roadmap for us. It just kind of maybe creates some degree of direction based on the details. And so whenever you're hearing someone speak, maybe that wasn't the best example, but hopefully people get what I'm saying. Whenever you're hearing someone speak, if you're hearing them very confidently recommending very specific paths, that should maybe raise somewhat of a red flag in the sense that if they're speaking about quote unquote science in a very confident way, right? Which is different from, let's say, expressing an opinion. And especially in the context of like you or any content creator just qualifying, like, hey, this is my opinion and this is my speculation. I think then making recommendations to people after those words have been said is perfectly fine. I think problems start to arise when people are giving descriptions of science and then offering prescriptions that are based specifically on those descriptions as if that is something that the description is actually capable of doing, right? Science, again, doesn't prescribe, it just describes. So I think that is probably the number one thing to look out for is really just the confidence and recommendation, and more specifically, the confidence and recommendation based off of, this one study or that one study or this new meta-analysis, right? That says rest less, get more, those kinds of things. So whenever your sort of bullshit detectors in that realm go off, I think that's a pretty good framework for identifying maybe bullshit from not. And beyond that, what I would say is whenever someone says something, and I try to like at least to some degree emphasize this, and especially in my YouTube videos, um, like try to think about the alternatives to what they've said, even if maybe intuitively you agree. Right. So Ethan, this is something that I feel like I have picked up from our conversations, which is even if you agree on the outset with something that I said, over the maybe it's like in the same conversation or over the next couple days, you'll kind of think about it more and almost actively look for like, hey, when could this like alternative thing be the case? Like, in what context might this thing be useful, or in what context can I challenge Ben on what he said, or can I disagree with Ben on what he said? And so I think that the sort of like building blocks of the scientific mindset are kind of just, again, to go back to the whole curiosity thing, it's just kind of wondering like, what if this weren't actually true? Or like, in what circumstances might this not be true? And I think that how that practically applies is just that in your own training, again, assuming most of the people listening to this have the goal of like they enjoy training, maybe they want to get bigger, they want to get stronger. That is like that is a problem solving framework, altogether. So the more that you can kind of have those conversations with yourself, or like you mentioned, other people, mentors, where you can comfortably disagree and challenge and think about alternatives, the more that you can just improve the skill of thinking and improve the skill of problem solving. And the more that you consume content, then the more that you're actually practicing that ability to question and practicing that ability to remain curious rather than just blindly accepting information. And I think that that has implications far beyond just you in the weight room trying to get bigger. That's like a life thing, right? Like that's how you navigate conversations and problems with people, you know? So that's kind of where I would go with that in terms of practical implications and applications. Is there anything else, Ethan, that you wanted to say, perhaps about the Coke Zero Oreo flavor in your experience with it?
Have you noticed, like, when I'm holding this can, you really can't tell if it's a normal size can or a mini can, but there's a part of me that likes to think that someone out there thinks this is a normal can.
Yeah, you just have those quarterback
Like,
hands.
just like completely I mean, if you're not
Yeah.
watching, it's just. complete silliness, but my hand completely covers the can.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so yeah, anything else on that topic?
No, I think that about covers it.
All right, fantastic. Everyone will be back next week with the normal time, normal day, hopefully. And I hope everyone had a great Thanksgiving week.